The world order as we've known it is being upended. Great powers and strongmen are trying to use their muscle and might to expand their territory. And there's no person better placed to help us understand these tectonic shifts than the BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen. From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman in London, with my co-host Asma Khaled in Washington, DC. And today on The Global Story, the post-World War II era is over. What comes next? I wanted to just go back in time a little bit and set up where the idea of a rules-based international order came from. So last weekend, Jeremy, on Saturday, I found myself listening to a speech by Winston Churchill. It was a speech he gave in 1943 to Harvard University about the way he saw the world after the Second World War. Basically, he said the United States has a responsibility to operate in the world. It cannot withdraw from the world. If there was going to be peace after the Second World War, there needed to be something that he called a World Council. So I guess something resembling the UN Security Council. What do you make of that ambition to create this kind of international rules-based world order? Was it an admirable thing or was it misguided?
It was, of course, admirable after the horrors of the Second World War and indeed the horrors of the first half of the 20th century to try to find a better way. There had been a failure after the First World War. There was an international organization called the League of Nations that never really worked. So after the World War II, so much had changed. The United States had become a world power, a world military power. It was an industrial power. The old European powers were broken, Britain included. Britain was bankrupt. And when Churchill was speaking in that speech you referenced, his whole strategy in the Second World War, apart from just fighting on, was trying to get the Americans as engaged as possible. There were rules because awful things had happened, and they brought in things like the Genocide Convention and a lot of the fabric of international law that we might recognize now. But naturally, there were other things going on. States do things not out of charity. They do things because it benefits them. And the feeling was that some sort of apparatus of Western security, with America leading it, would benefit America. It was going to benefit America in all kinds of ways to have Europe rebuilt. It would, in terms of getting some stability in a continent that had been terribly unstable, in providing new markets as well for the Americans. And as the relations between the West and the Soviet Union rapidly deteriorated after the Second World War and the Cold War kicked in and started going, there was something else happening too, that there was a sense that they had to get together to try and get a structure to stop what was seen by some at the time as the inexorable rise of communism and Soviet power. So by 1947, Britain was bankrupt. And Britain sent a message to the Americans saying, we can't do what we would like to do. We can't afford it. We haven't got the money. What can you do? The then president of the United States, Harry Truman, decided that America had to formalize its global post-war role. And really, what he came up with, the Truman Doctrine, which was an idea that America would intervene in conflicts to protect people and also in their own interests. And really, it was about resisting Soviet communism. After the speech that Harry Truman did, through this idea of a Truman Doctrine. And out of the Truman Doctrine came the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And out of that, too, came, in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty, which was the foundation of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And those things allied with the other conventions, genocide, various rights, human rights, rights of the child, and so on that came in, all of those things shaped the way that they thought the post-war world might go. And for a while, in different places, it did work, actually, in some ways. But now, many years later, things have changed.
This new world order that was created in the aftermath of World War II, complete with some of these large-scale global institutions if we look at something like NATO, you mentioned, a major, the largest national security alliance, these were created in the aftermath of the war. And whether or not they were done with, you could say, altruistic intentions or not is debatable. But nonetheless, there was a direct line.
I don't think nations are
I
altruistic.
know, exactly.
I think they're self-interested. I'm a
Yes.
realist in these things. Not everybody is, but I am.
So, nonetheless, though, regardless of their intentions, there was broadly this direct line between the Truman Doctrine after World War II, I would say maybe with some ebbs and flows, but up until Biden's foreign policy during the last U.S. administration. You have written this really thought-provoking analysis piece, I would say, on the BBC website, where you talk about whether Donald Trump now is now creating a new world order. And so I want to dig into that in a little bit more depth. You have been reporting for the BBC for, what is it, four decades? Is that right, Jeremy? 4 decades. More than 4 decades,
Something like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So you've
I'm losing count.
you've seen, nonetheless, where this doctrine has worked and where perhaps it hasn't worked. So let's begin with that. Is there a story where the rules-based order that was created after World War II worked as it was intended to function?
First, let me say that from the outset, the idea of this rules-based order, not everybody accepted it was going to be a great idea. And as European empires decolonized in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, countries became independent. They didn't necessarily want to be told what to do by the old colonial powers plus the United States and the other superpowers, Soviet Union or whatever. There was something called the non-aligned movement in that period where countries said, we're not going to be part of the East or the West. We're going to try and do things for ourselves. But yes, certainly in terms of the security of Western countries, and you asked for a specific example. Now, this isn't actually about European security. At the time, it was seen as something about global security. And that was the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein, the authoritarian leader, the dictator of Iraq in the summer of 1990, August of 1990.
The first Gulf War,
and
yes, yeah.
First Gulf War. And as a fairly young reporter, I was part of the BBC reporting of that. I went to Saudi Arabia just after the invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, drove up to the border with Kuwait, where there was meant to be a ring of steel already there. The Americans had started deploying troops to Saudi Arabia. There was an enormous military buildup, leading in the end to the operation to remove the Iraqis from Kuwait, major, of course, oil-producing country. And at the time, the United States and the West very much depended on oil coming from the Gulf, from the Arabian Gulf. The system worked, I think, because the then president, George H.W. Bush, went to the United Nations, and he was a guy, if ever there was a rules-based order guy, it was probably the first President Bush. And he was someone who went to the UN, and he did it all through various UN resolutions. And the UN resolutions passed, and they were enforceable resolutions. President Bush took really big steps to deploy a vast army with a lot of help from allies to the Gulf area, particularly to Saudi Arabia. But he did it with the authorization of United Nations resolutions. So there was international legality on its side.
And the stated justification for this intervention was that it was not acceptable that Iraq try to annex territory of a neighboring country.
Under the UN Charter, the only justifications for legal military action are self-defense, one, being invited. If a country is invited by a state to fight for them, to help with their self-defense, that would be one. And also, if there is authorization through a resolution under the relevant resolution through the Security Council. So there has to be one of these Chapter 7 resolutions that is voted through that can authorize the legal use of military force. And they got one of those through.
By contrast, what would you say was an example of a story that you reported on where the so-called international rules-based order didn't work?
So the 2003 invasion, of course, had catastrophic consequences in terms of the Pandora's box of killing that it unleashed, which went on for many, many years, and more than 20 years on in the Middle East, they are still dealing with the consequences of that invasion, one of which was the rise of jihadi groups, which in the end morphed into Islamic State, ISIS. But one of the big issues about that invasion was they couldn't get a second UN resolution authorizing specific action.
Because famously the French vetoed it, right?
Well, the French were against it. So they couldn't get the same sort of consensus that George Bush Sr. had, but they went ahead anyway. And not long after that, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, well, yeah, they broke international law. This is an illegal invasion. He said that in a BBC interview, but it was a year or two afterwards. And part of the consequences, I think, but part of the, if you like, the original sin of that invasion was it didn't have that legality. And more recently, of course, the war in Gaza has been, it's looking very much to be a textbook case in the way that international laws have been violated by all parties. War crimes have been committed. Certainly the evidence appears to be that. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and various and the former Defense Minister, and also issued arrest warrants for the entire senior leadership of Hamas, all of whom have been killed by Israel.
Jeremy, can I pause a bit? Because here we are having this conversation about a new world order, the breakdown of the way the rules were intended to work for decades. And yet there were many people at the time, we're talking about 2 decades ago, that the U.S. Invaded Iraq, but there was a lot of criticism at the time from folks wondering, well, are we actually living in a rules-based order, or has this system been just set up to be a sort of cover for American power and muscle? Makes me wonder, well, was the system really functioning as it was intended to function 20-some years ago? Was it already breaking down at that point?
I don't think the system has ever functioned perfectly. There's almost never been a point when it didn't function at times really quite badly. International laws have been quite widely broken, especially by the most powerful countries in the world, repeatedly since the Second World War. And the criticism of the idea of a rules-based international order is that they're Western rules. And they're Western rules which are normally applied to adversaries of the West. And they are applied in either a half-hearted or not applied at all way to the friends of the West and members of the Western side of things. So it's very imperfect. But I think what is changing right now is that Donald Trump doesn't even pay lip service to it. It shows every sign of wanting to sweep it all away. And while it has always been flawed, I do think it has provided a framework and a degree of predictability or stability.
As a counterpoint to the 2 examples that you gave of places that would seem to prove that the international rules-based order hasn't worked. So the second Gulf War and Gaza, there are people who might say that those 2 wars, those 2 conflicts are examples of why it's right to try and pursue a rules-based international order. What would be your response to that?
I think those are all fair points. There's no doubt about it. I think that what these international rules over the years, international humanitarian law, war crimes laws, the Geneva Conventions, the UN Charter, all those sorts of things, they provide a template against which you can measure the severity of a story. It's not simply saying, well, this is awful, all these people are dying, but getting to something a little bit more forensic where you can say, for example, well, you shouldn't blow up hospitals, but if someone sets up a firing position on the top of the hospital, then you're perfectly entitled to destroy that firing position. And if the hospital gets damaged as well, that's not an illegal act. So it's I think it's a rule again. That structure of laws and customs and charters and all the things that are there, it is a way of trying to hold people, hold states to, and hold leaders to account. But yeah, it's never worked perfectly well. But I think the question you also have to ask is, if you don't have it, what do you have?
Well, why don't we talk for a moment, Jeremy, then about what is the alternative and what we're witnessing right now from President Trump. He has outlined this self-described done row doctrine. He wants to focus more, he says, on the Western Hemisphere. And it seems that he believes in almost going back in time to this era of empires kind of carving out the world into these different spheres of influences. But it strikes me that maybe that's not possible in the year 2026 to do ever so neatly. I mean, all this week we've been looking at this story, and yet there are large swaths of the globe that we haven't talked about in depth. I mean, where does Iran, where does India, where does Europe, frankly, fit into this suggested new paradigm?
The reason why I think the idea of returning to the way things were back when Britain was a world power at the end of the 19th century, when there were spheres of influence, very much so, the way it doesn't work in the modern world is because the world has changed. When European countries, the French, the British, were carving up Africa and different parts of the world between them, they were dealing with countries that in the main were not developed, where if there were elites, they were probably kings and people who'd inherited their massive wealth, and that the vast majority of people lived very hard lives and weren't very well educated, if at all. Things are massively different now. You look at the incredible transformations in India. I mean, that's one good example. India was the jewel in the crown, as they always say, of the British Empire in that period of spheres of influence back at the end of the 19th century. Now India is a rising power with more than 1 billion people, and undoubtedly is going to be a stronger and bigger power as it continues to develop. And they don't want to be part of anyone's sphere of influence. They want to have their own sphere of influence. They have their own regional issues with their neighbors in Pakistan and so on, but they want to be very influential. The world has changed so much that it's going to be very difficult for a couple of strong leaders to impose their will on everybody.
Both you and Tristan are joining us from London, and we haven't talked at all about how Europe fits into this new world order.
That's because Europe is feeling like we're bystanders, that we're watching things which we can't control anymore. I think this is possibly a little milestone in the continued decline of Europe, because while the European Union particularly is a powerful economic unit, politically it's quite disunited and militarily it's nowhere. They still need the Americans for security, because they've had actually, and this is a point which is Trump has made, and many presidents before Trump made this point, that security-wise, they have been freeloading off the backs of Americans for a long time. The Americans paid the money because they felt it was in their interests. Trump doesn't feel it's in the U.S. interests or his interests, so he doesn't want to pay the money. And that's one thing that has changed, because that consensus that American security meant European security has gone. I mean, absolutely gone, certainly as far as the Trump administration is concerned.
Asma and I have had quite animated conversations about whether it's a given that this ends in more chaos or maybe stability. What's your take?
Well, I hate to say it, I'm on the chaos side. Having been a foreign correspondent for the BBC for most of my adult life, and I have been to many, many wars as a reporter, and seen hopes risen and hopes dashed. I think this is a really worrying time. I think we are absolutely right to worry about the stability of the world. Look at the way the world is, the number of places that are on fire, the number of places where conflicts aren't just not being resolved, they're getting worse. The big question, perhaps, is how the Americans and the Chinese sort out their relationship. If they can achieve some degree of strategic, economic, military stability between them, And maybe the answer is that the Americans say, look, this is our half of the world and we'll try and do what we can here, and that's your half of the world. Maybe that's an answer. But China's a rising power. It's getting stronger. And America is still massively powerful militarily and economically, but history says that empires and superpowers don't last forever. One of the things that would stop, you'd hope, things slipping out of control is some kind of rules-based system
A safety net.
if you like, if there's a shape, rules and customs that people at least can be held to account if they don't follow them, in a way you know where you are. But if it's quite a chaotic, might is right atmosphere happening in the world, well, it guarantees a great deal of work for people like me, but frankly, a lot of worry for anyone who wants to live a peaceful life.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Not at all, and thanks for asking me.
The Global Story is also available in audio 5 days a week. Search for us on bbc.com or wherever you get your podcasts.